Hello, listeners. This talk is about a crisis or series of crises that I believe Mahometanism is currently facing or will face fairly soon. And although recent events may have alarmed a lot of people and they may think that Mahometanism is on the march, it's on the rise and so on, I think that Mahometanism is actually in its death throes at this point. Hopefully by the end of this talk you'll understand just what I'm on about, why I believe that to be true, and you'll come to agree with me somewhat, or at least feel more optimistic about the prospect of Mahometanism not taking over the world. So it is my belief that Mahometanism is locked in a life and death struggle with Europe. If Europe loses, and I don't think it will, but if Europe loses, then Mahometanism will become a major spoiler, should I say, for world civilization. But I don't think that it will go on to conquer the world if it manages to defeat Europe. I think that there would be other immune responses, which I actually think are present in Europe. They're just hidden, but they're certainly present in other cultures, other civilizations. I think those immune responses would kick in, and Mahometanism would probably be destroyed in a fairly major war. But as I said, I don't think Mahometanism is actually going to overcome Europe. I think Europeans are waking up to this now, and they will resist Mahometanism and fight back, essentially. And they will overcome the existential crisis posed by Mahometanism to Western civilization in Europe. So I think that at most, all Mahometanism can do is drag others down. I don't think it will actually eventually amount to anything itself. And there are a number of reasons why I believe this. The first is demographics. I'm going to show you some graphs in a moment to do with demographics in the Mahometan world. But basically, what is happening now in the Mahometan world is there's a big demographic wave that is coming to adulthood or has come to adulthood. And that's a large part of why there are so many young men, particularly who are migrating and invading the West. But this demographic wave is breaking, as you'll see when I show you these graphs. And in many ways it represents the last big chance that Mahometanism has at having any sort of major effect upon other places in the world. Because the fertility rates in the Mahometan world are actually collapsing quite rapidly. So let's have a look at these graphs. The first graph is of the top 5 most populous Mahometan nations. This is purely by how many people they have, how many Mahometans they have in each of these nations. So on this graph there are 6 lines, and I'll just read those out. It's a little bit difficult to understand everything on this graph, so I'll refer to the raw data after that. But basically on this graph you have a sort of an orange line, that's Indonesia, a pink line, that's Pakistan, a light blue line, that's India, a green line, that is Bangladesh, and a red line, that is Egypt. And then in dark blue you have the average of those top 5 nations. On the x-axis you can see the years, and the most recent data was from 2013, so I've just gone back a decade at a time from then, so 2003, 1993 and 1983. And on the y-axis we have total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the number of children that a woman will have in her lifetime. So let me just talk about these countries a little bit. The way I determined these was I looked at the percentage they have of the total population of Mahometans in the world. And I just took the 5 countries that had the highest percentage of that total population. So Indonesia has 12.7% of Mahometans in the world. Pakistan has 11%. India has 10.9%. Now, India is not actually a Mahometan nation, but it has so many Mahometans there that it's actually the 3rd largest Mahometan nation, even though there are more Hindus there, for instance. And the Mahometans actually represent 14.6% of India. Then Bangladesh is the country number 4, and that has 9.2% of the world's Mahometans. And then in 5th place is Egypt on 4.9% of the world's Mahometans. Now, looking at the total fertility rate, I'll go through each nation one at a time. So Indonesia, in 1983, it had a TFR of 4. Then it went to 2.8 in 1993, and 2.5 in 2003, and 2.3 in 2013. Replacement level, the number that is required to stop a country from dying and getting older, is 2.1. So currently Indonesia is only just above replacement level, and it's likely that it will fall below replacement level probably within the next decade. So Indonesia, the world's most populous Mahometan nation, is actually rapidly approaching replacement level or even sub-replacement level. Pakistan was on 6.5 in 1983, then it went to 5.6 in 1993, then 4 in 2003, and it's currently on 3.2. So it's a fair way above replacement level, but it's declining. It's still declining. India. Now, this is complicated by the fact that this TFR is for India as a whole, so there might be different TFRs for Muslims and other groups within India. I don't know, so I've just taken the TFR for India as a whole. And that was on 4.4 in 1983. It declined to 3.6 in 1993, then 3 in 2003, and 2.5 in 2013. So that's another nation that's quite likely to actually fall below replacement levels within the next decade or so. Then Bangladesh. Bangladesh was on 5.9 in 1983, then 4 in 1993, 2.8 in 2003, and it currently sits on 2.2, so it's only just above replacement level. And it's almost certain that it's going to decline below replacement level within the next few years. Probably, it may already be at that point, it's hard to say, but probably within the next few years at the latest. And then Egypt. Egypt was on 5.2 in 1983, then it went to 3.9 in 1993, 3.1 in 2003, and is on 2.8 now. So that's a reasonable amount above replacement level, but even still, it's slowing. It's not slowing as much as some of the others, or rather, it's not declining as much as some of the others. It's slowing down in its decline, but it's still declining in terms of fertility levels. Now, if we look at the average for these top 5 countries, in 1983, these 5 countries had an average of 5.2, then 3.98 in 1993, 3.08 in 2003, and 2.6 in 2013. So the top 5 Mahometan nations are not that much above replacement level. And if we look at a weighted average, so that's where I multiply by their percentages, basically, as a percentage of the world population. then the weighted average for those 5 countries is 2.58. So these nations, it's worth pointing out that these nations between them represent approximately half of the world's Mahometans. So the population is slowing down. The population growth is slowing down, and people are getting older in these nations. Now, let's look at the top 10. So it's a similar sort of thing to the other graph. I'll just tell you the names of the countries. So in orange we have Nigeria, then in pink we have Iran, in light blue we have Turkey, in dark green we have Algeria, in red we have Morocco, and then I have the top 5 average. So the average from the previous graph is a point of comparison in dark blue, and the average of the top 10 countries in light green. So let me just look at the raw data because it's a little bit easier to explain, though you can see the trend obviously from the graph. Now if we look at the next 5 countries, so from 6 to 10, Nigeria is 4.7% of world Mahometans. And actually, Nigeria is a country where approximately half the population is Mahometan and approximately half is Christian. And that's actually quite common in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa does have very high fertility rates, but that's true of both Christian and Mahometan nations. So the problems with those countries are not so much Mahometan as Dindu, shall we say. So Nigeria had a fertility rate of 6.7 in 1983, then 6.3 in 1993, 6 in 2003, and it remained at 6 in 2013. Nigeria still has very high fertility rates, and that's true of sub-Saharan Africa in general, regardless of whether those countries are Mahometan or Christian. The next country on our list is Iran. Iran represents 4.6% of the world's Mahometans. And Iran was at 6.5 in 1983, then 3.8 in 1993, 1.9 in 2003. So it dipped below replacement level in 2003. And it was also at 1.9 in 2013. And that's on a par with a few Western nations, actually. So Iran is actually below replacement levels, and they're going to get much older as a nation within coming decades. So they're pretty much out of the game already, actually. Turkey is next. Turkey is also 4.6% of world Mahometans, and they were on 4 in 1983, then they went to 2.8 in 1993, 2.3 in 2003, and 2 in 2013. Now, Turkey is becoming more Mahometan and more hardline as well, but nevertheless they're below replacement levels in Turkey, and I think they're going to have some problems there as well. The next nation is Algeria, and they represent 2.1% of Mahometans in the world. So they're not actually a very significant country, but they come in at number 9. It's really those first 5 countries, or the first 4 actually, that have most of the world's Mahometans, and they're all in decline, as I mentioned earlier. Now, Algeria was on 6.4 in 1983, then 4 in 1993, 2.4 in 2003, and it actually increased slightly to 2.8 in 2013, which is a slightly troubling sign, though their percentage of the world's Mahometans is so small, it's still not very significant. Morocco is actually in a similar situation. They're 2% of the world's Mahometans, and they were on 5.3 in 1983, then 3.6 in 1993, then 2.5 in 2003, then 2.7 in 2013. So again, they increased slightly also. if we look at the average for the top 10, this is actually really distorted by Nigeria. But nevertheless, let's have a look at these numbers. The average for the top 10 Mahometan nations in 1983 was 5.49, then 4.04 in 1993, 3.05 in 2003, and 2.84 in 2013. So it's slightly higher than the average for the top 5, which is 2.6. But the countries with higher fertility rates, or it's really Nigeria that's causing the problems here. But nevertheless, these countries all have very small percentages of the world population of Mahometans. And if we look at a weighted top 10, you'll really see that difference. It goes from 2.84 down to 2.74. Now, this is a problem for the Mahometan world, obviously. Basically, these countries, as I mentioned earlier, they had a big wave that really sort of came to adulthood. I mean, if you look at the when they sort of last had very high fertility rates, for many countries it was the 90s, or recently the beginning of last decade. So those people have already hit adulthood, or will very soon. If they were part of that wave in the 1990s, then they're already adults now, essentially. They're in their 20s now, so they'll be having children now. But they'll have fewer children than previous generations did, and in many cases they'll have sub-replacement levels. And those who were born in 2003, for instance, those guys, they're 12 years old now. So in another decade or so, another 10 to 15 years, they'll be having kids. But if these trends continue, they won't have as many kids in their children's generation as exist in their own generation. So this wave of births in the Mahometan world is a wave that's peaked and is crashing at the moment. Now, of course, the big problem is that Europe has its own fertility issues, but it's worth pointing out with Europe, this is something that could be turned around. I mean, it could be turned around in the Mahometan world also, though I don't think so. I think they're getting squashed by modernity. But nevertheless, this is an issue that's only a couple of generations old in Europe. Indeed, in 1960, there were only 2 countries in Europe, Latvia and Hungary, that were on sub-replacement total fertility levels. And even in 1970, the majority were still at or above replacement levels for TFR. So this is only a fairly recent problem for Europe. And I think Europe is in a better position because of its development levels and so on, and other issues such as environmental factors and so on, to turn this around. I don't think this is going to be turned around in the Mahometan world. I think they're facing a real crunch because the countries that are even remotely developed, so countries like Turkey or Iran, and when I say developed, they're considerably less developed than European nations, for instance. But nevertheless, the countries that are even remotely developed are at or below replacement levels for TFR, or they'll be there very soon. For instance, Saudi Arabia is actually getting to that point, oddly enough. Back in 1983, Saudi Arabia had a fertility rate of 6.9, which is enormous. They're currently on 2.6. It's not inconceivable that within the next decade or so they will be below replacement levels. And so there'll be a wave that sort of carries over for a little while longer. But even the center of the Mahometan world and the place where where all the craziness comes from, even that place is facing a demographic crunch within the next few years. So anywhere that is developed is experiencing the same problems that Europe faced in the 1970s or thereabouts. So they're rapidly catching up, and they have all of the trappings of modernity. They have electronic gadgets and other consumer items. Even though they're not fully developed, they have these things. They seem to be getting eaten by modernity in the same way that Europe and North America, Australia, Japan, all of these places are getting eaten by modernity. They're obsessed with the trappings of consumerism and so on. And they only seem to have one response to that. Their only response seems to be to try to return to the 7th century. Because for reasons I'll get to later on in this talk, they don't seem to be able to exist and compete in the modern world. Now, this idea of returning to the 7th century is appealing to some people, but not the majority. I think these demographic trends are going to continue. The overwhelming majority of people in the Middle East, for instance, or North Africa, are going to want to have the latest gadgets, the latest fashion, all the rest of it that people in Europe or North America, Australia, East Asia, that all of these people have, and the things that seem to be aiding in crashing their fertility levels. Those people, they're not going to give those things up so that they can recreate the 7th century. The overwhelming majority of them are simply not going to do that. And so they're going to be in the same boat that everyone else is in. And some of them are already in that boat. Iran, Turkey, a few others. Indonesia's pretty close as well, right? I don't think that's going to reverse. Now, the countries that are not like this are the really undeveloped countries. So countries like Afghanistan, or places that have had war and so on. So Afghanistan's also in that position, but Iraq. Or they are places that are basically Dindu. And as I mentioned earlier, these problems with fertility rates, high fertility rates in the Dindu world are a Dindu problem because the Christian nations in sub-Saharan Africa also have very high fertility rates. So it's not so much a Mahometan issue, it's a Dindu issue. But these places are really going to have a lot of problems. Indeed, a lot of nations in the Middle East are going to have problems. All of these places are extremely dysfunctional, and I think they're going to be consumed by Malthusian traps fairly soon. A lot of these places don't have enough food to feed themselves. Many of them don't have water. Jordan, for instance, is going to use up all of its aquifers within the next few decades, and that's a common problem in a lot of these places because they couldn't support their populations previously, and so they've really only been able to do that with aid from the West. But they often live in places that are not very well suited to agriculture and so on and so forth. So they don't get enough rain, they can't feed themselves and so on and so forth. And there's environmental degradation. They're often very bad at looking after their environment. Europe generally is pretty good at looking after its environment. These other places are not. So I think Europe could maintain its current level of population quite easily with its current agricultural resources. That's not true of much of the Mahometan world. They're going to face really huge Malthusian traps very, very soon as a result of this. They're not going to be able to maintain their massive growth rates in population as a result of this. They just won't be able to. In fact, a lot of them are going to experience massive population crashes because they'll just simply run out of water and topsoil and all of these other things. They're going to be in real trouble. They're not going to be able to produce food. And I think this is going to really come to a head once Western nations reach various points of crisis. So social crisis, economic crisis, military crisis. I mean, if there's a big war in Europe, which I think there is going to be, Europe is not going to be in the position where it will either be able to or will be willing to just throw foreign aid money at the Middle East or parts of Africa. They won't be able to do that. I mean, if they're fighting a big war, or if there's another worldwide economic crisis, pardon me, they're just not going to have the resources to throw at these places. And Western resources, make no mistake, Western resources, whether it's food or medicine or other things, people going there and, building wells or something, those are the only things propping these countries up. These countries, left to their own devices, both because of the environment and just how sort of useless their cultures are and so on, how corrupt and inefficient and bad at innovating and doing science and all of this sort of stuff. Left to their own devices, these countries would have a much lower carrying capacity than they currently have. And indeed, historically, that was the case. It was really only Western aid in the form of medicine and food and infrastructure and all of this sort of stuff that allowed these countries to experience very rapid, sustained growth rates in terms of their populations during the 20th century. Prior to that, they didn't have the populations they do now. And I think that once Europe in particular finds itself in a state of crisis of one form or another, or multiple crises even, the foreign aid is going to dry up. They might still get some from other parts of the world, but a large part of that comes from Europe. And Europeans are not going to be able to, let alone willing, I guess, they're not going to be able to throw this foreign aid at these places, and they're just going to plummet in terms of their populations. I mean, there'll be all these flow-on effects. There'll be more people fleeing those countries, whether they're refugees or migrants or invaders, whatever you want to call them. There will, for a time, be that kind of thing, but then the populations will sort of reach a new equilibrium that's considerably lower than where it is now. So I think, there might be a couple of rough decades. But then again, if Europe finds itself engaged in a big war, for instance, and it wins that war, where are these guys going to go? Some of them might be let into other nations, though how eager would other places in the world be to let these people in if they had just sort of witnessed Europe fight a war or series of bloody wars over the course of 5 years or 10 years or something? I don't think they'll let them in, to be honest. And I think these people will just be stuck. They'll be sort of quarantined in a way wherever they're from. They won't be let out from those places. They might move within the region to neighbouring countries, but they won't be let into anywhere advanced or civilised. And the Malthusian trap will just descend upon them. The jaws of the Malthusian trap will slam shut on these people. So I think the developed or semi-developed Mahometan nations are going to slowly get older, and I don't think they'll be too keen actually to let all these guys into their countries. And the countries that aren't developed or that have sort of large amounts of environmental degradation or the wrong climate or not enough water or whatever, those places are going to be hell on earth. So from a demographic standpoint, this is something that's often missed because people see all these guys moving to Europe and they have lots of kids and so on in Europe. But outside of Europe, they're actually in real trouble. So as long as Europe can resist them over coming decades, I think if they can last 20 or 30 years, then it's game over for the Mahometan world. Now, there are other issues why I think the Mahometan world is in trouble. There's a common narrative that people push that a lot of the problems in the Mahometan world are to do with imperialism or American involvement, colonialism by European nations and all of that sort of stuff. And people say, well, this is why there are problems with the Mahometan world, and that's a large part of why there's white guilt, and a lot of the issues that exist in Europe now are the direct result of people buying into this narrative. But I don't think that narrative is actually going to have any currency for very much longer. And there are two possible reasons for this. The first one is that, this is excluding the possibility of Mahometanism taking over Europe, which I don't think it will. The first possibility is that the West undergoes some sort of renaissance. For it to do that, if it wins its existential crisis and then it reinvents itself, by definition, that will require a complete abandonment of white guilt, liberalism, and all of the stuff that goes along with that. So multiculturalism, all the rest. If the West rises again or gets back on its feet, then by definition, this narrative will be abandoned, and so the West won't care. These guys will they'll still complain. They'll still say, "Oh, you guys have been so mean to us," and the West will say, "Well, we don't care. We just beat you in a war. Go away. We're not going to listen to this nonsense anymore." That was a bunch of traitors who ran that narrative for several decades. We've dealt with you. We've dealt with them. We don't want to hear it anymore. Go away. The other possibility is that the West gets eclipsed, probably by East Asia, economically. And the US is also assimilated into Latin America. So the West is no longer number one in the world. If the West is no longer number one in the world, it's the new number one is not going to be the Mahometan world, because they're just too dysfunctional for a whole lot of reasons I'll get into shortly. And whoever ends up in power, of course, that would be bad to a certain extent for world civilization if both Europe and the US were broken or became something different. I think East Asia would probably limp onwards somewhat. But regardless of who might replace the West, those other people won't care either about this narrative for a number of reasons. The first one is that a lot of these countries, and in particular I'm thinking of Japan, Korea and Taiwan, these countries have little to no historic connection with Mahometanism. China has some, India has some, obviously, and I'll get to them in a second. But these other countries have basically no historic connection with Mahometanism. So their response would be, all right, so the white man was really bad to you, American imperialism, rah, rah, rah. Okay, great. What does that have to do with us? It wasn't us. We didn't do it, so we don't care. That's what East Asia is essentially going to say to the Mahometan world. We don't care. And that's also true of Latin America as well. So if America ends up becoming quite Latin American, again, a bunch of guys whose families were from Mexico or wherever, Guatemala or something, they're going to say, okay, the gringo was a bad guy. Yeah. But what does that have to do with us? So whomever might knock the West off its perch at number one, they're just not going to care about all this nonsense to do with the West interfering in the Middle East and, rah-rah, all this nonsense, right? Also, these people in other parts of the world, some of the others have complicated relationships with Mahometanism. So China, India and Russia, they all have complicated relationships. In some cases, they were ruled over by them, or they had long periods of struggle against Mahometan populations, and they don't see them as victims. They see Mahometans as aggressors. They recognize them for what they are, basically. But what I'm getting at here is that basically outside of the West, everyone else doesn't care about what's happened to the Mahometan world at best. At worst, they know that the Mahometan world has been aggressive towards them. And they also lack this concept of white guilt, or some sort of equivalent to white guilt. They don't have that. That's a really Western thing, white guilt. They just don't have that. Now, China is getting involved in various parts of the world, particularly in Africa, and it will probably have to navigate some of the perils of that in the future. But I don't know. Maybe they will have an empire, and then maybe they'll suffer the fallout from that, as Britain did and has and is or France or some other Western European nations, and to some extent the US as well. I don't think so, though. I don't really think they will. So in this regard, I think the Mahometan world, even if it overcomes the West and it thinks, right, we're going to have a go at someone else, I don't know, Russia or China or something, we're going to stir up trouble in the northwest of China, in Xinjiang or something. China's not going to care. They're just going to bomb them, basically. They're just going to shoot them. There will be an immune response from these places. I think that immune response is actually coming with the West as well. Another issue, of course, for a lot of these places is that they have also dealt with imperialism. With the exception of Japan, all of these other parts of the world have had they've been on the receiving end of imperialism. In some cases, Japanese imperialism. In other cases, Western imperialism, and they've had to deal with that. They've had to emerge from that and make something of themselves in post-colonialism. In particular, I'm thinking of Korea. So after World War II, Korea was a Japanese colony, and then after World War II, they had the Korean War in the early 50s. When was that? I think it was 1953 or 1954, something like that. And they were broken by that war. They were really destroyed by that war, and they had to receive a lot of foreign aid and so on. Korea didn't really and doesn't have any natural resources as such, and yet over the intervening 3 generations, Korea has built itself into a developed nation. This is true of other places in East Asia also. I mean, Japan was already developed, but this is true in Taiwan. This is happening now in China. It's happening in other places such as Vietnam. It's happened in Singapore. And these nations will look at the Mahometan world and they will say, 60 years ago, we had a GDP per capita on a par with sub-Saharan Africa. We're actually poorer than a lot of countries in Africa and the Middle East. And we're now way in front of you guys. We've done this without oil money. We've done this without any other resources. We've done this simply by pushing ourselves through the hard work of our people, through studying, decent governance, and all the rest of it. We've done it. What's your excuse? You can't keep leaning on this excuse of imperialism because we were once under someone else's thumb. You know, China had its century of shame in the 19th century and into the 20th century with the after effects of the Opium Wars. And they will just turn around and say, we've done it. What's your excuse? We don't want to hear it. And how will the Mahometan world respond to that? Now, of course, this assumes that East Asia won't get paused by the cathedral, and there's a danger of that. But I don't think they will. I don't think they can't buy into a lot of the white guilt that the West has simply because they don't have any historic connection to these places, as I mentioned earlier. You know, the British or the French, they can buy into that because they did have empires in Africa and the Middle East. You know, there was no equivalent to the Sykes-Picot, I think that's the name of the treaty, the Sykes-Picot Treaty at the end of World War I between Britain and France that divided up the Middle East. There was no equivalent to that with the Koreans. They didn't have their Sykes-Picot Treaty that gave them a little piece of the Middle East. They'll say, what's your excuse? We emerged from imperialism. We built something. You guys are just complaining. Shut up. We don't want to hear it. I think that's what's going to happen if East Asia takes over. And if Mahometanism continues to pick this fight, particularly with China, because China does have Mahometans in the northwest, in Xinjiang, with the Uyghurs and some other groups, but they're not going to buy into all this. They're just going to shoot them. They're just going to bomb them. And if Mahometans really start screwing around, I mean, imagine something equivalent to 9/11. I think it would be, or this recent thing in Paris. I can't see that the Chinese would pussyfoot around with all of this. And as I said, these nations are developing or have developed. And what does the Mahometan world have to offer anyone? How have they developed? What are they famous for? I mean, if you buy any consumer product, the chances are that it's made in Asia, East Asia now, and has been for decades. And some of these products are very good now. They're not all rubbish. They're always getting better. But what is the Mahometan world famous for? What's going to happen when they run out of oil? And on the topic of oil, I read an article a few weeks ago, a month ago, or something like that, in I think it was in Asia Times, which is in Hong Kong, and it was discussing oil revenue and fiscal buffers. So I've got a graph here that I lifted from that article. It says it's titled "Fiscal Buffers and Break-Even Oil Prices 2015: Years and US dollars per barrel." So what this is about is basically in various Mahometan nations, the price they need oil to be at for them to be able to balance their budgets, essentially. So there are two things on this graph. The first thing is in yellow. The columns in yellow are basically the price required in US dollars per barrel of oil for these countries to be able to balance their budgets for fiscal break-even. And you can see there that the current baseline oil price for 2015 is that blue dotted line. And you can see that every single nation is above that dotted line, and some of them, Libya and Yemen, are so far above that dotted line they've actually had to truncate the lines. Those nations, all of those nations that have oil, are in serious trouble because the reason why they're so far above those levels is basically because they don't produce anything else. What do you know of from the Middle East, hence North Africa? What do they produce? I don't know, carpets, dates, suicide bombers. I mean, if they could make money from suicide bombers, then they'd be the richest countries in the world. But what do they produce? They don't produce anything. Other parts of the world produce things. They don't produce anything. They don't even produce any other sort of raw goods, primary industry. They don't have grain or sugar cane or something, right? They don't produce anything in those countries other than oil. And they buy off their populaces by basically throwing some gibs at them. They just throw a lot of gibs midats at them, and the populaces are bone idle. I mean, if you've been to the Middle East, I've only been to Turkey and Egypt, and Turkey and Egypt are sort of better than a lot of these other countries. But one of the things you notice about that part of the world is there are massive numbers of guys. Everywhere you go, there are massive numbers of guys sitting around all day. They do two things all day, basically, or three things all day. They go to the mosque and pray 5 times a day. They do all that stuff. Well, you can't get much work done if you're kneeling on a rug on the floor, for God knows how many hours a day. The other two things they do in conjunction are they sit around drinking cups of tea and they play backgammon. They're really good at backgammon. They're really good. They can actually throw the dice so they get the exact number they want. They're really good at cheating, right? I'm sure that comes as no surprise to people. But that's all they do all day. They don't do anything. If you go elsewhere in the world, people are busy. They're working. They're doing stuff. You don't see huge numbers of guys just hanging around. I mean, if you come to East Asia, you don't see people hanging around. Even in Europe with cafe culture, you don't get enormous numbers of guys just hanging around. The Middle East is just full of guys doing nothing, essentially, and the government buys them off. It just throws money at them. And so as you can see from that graph, they need oil to be at such a high price, particularly in Libya and Yemen, just because they have so many useless people getting gibs, essentially. Now, the other thing that's measured on that graph is the green diamonds, and that scale is on the right, and that scale is actually the number of years they have as fiscal buffers. So what that means is basically foreign currency reserves, essentially. How many years they could continue based upon the current price of oil, and they would eat through those reserves, how many years it would be until they'd run out of those reserves. Now, there are only 3 nations there that are somewhat healthy. They're over on the left, and coincidentally, or not coincidentally, they also have the lowest requirement for fiscal break-even for the price of oil, and presumably their workforces are somewhat more useful, and they don't throw as many gibs at them. So those countries, Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, they're all above 20 years, and the UAE is about 27, I think. So they're sort of okay, but look at the rest. I mean, it's a rogues gallery of financial Armageddon that's coming, and just sort of useless nations. I mean, look at Iraq. It's basically broke now. They're throwing gibs out at a higher rate than they can collect money from oil revenues, and they have no reserves. And you look at Yemen, right? Yemen's on 1 year, 2 years, I think, of reserves, and the rest aren't much better. The best of a bad bunch there is Iran, and they look to be on about 8. A lot of these countries are in serious trouble. Look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is on 6 years. Saudi Arabia is going to be in financial Armageddon. I believe, since I read this article, I read another one where they're already borrowing money. Now let's see where that ends, right? I mean, they're all hoping to outlast the current oil prices. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Some of them definitely won't. So in terms of the economics of these countries, they are screwed. They are utterly screwed. Most of them can't feed themselves. They don't have enough food. They're throwing out gibs as quickly as they can, and they're just burning through their reserves. They don't do anything else other than oil. As I mentioned earlier, some of them have all these environmental issues, not enough water, massive erosion of topsoil. I mean, these places are just hell waiting to happen, essentially. The Mahometan world, I know a lot of people on the alt-right are sort of really full of despair about all of this, but these places are going to collapse. Basically, if they don't beat Europe within the next, say, 20 years, they're screwed. It's game over for them, because they are so unable to compete on the world stage. They're so ill-prepared for modernity. I don't see how they can be a viable force ever again. This is it for them. If they don't defeat Europe within the next couple of decades, and even if they do, they'll still have to contend with rubbing China the wrong way, and Russia and India and so on, countries for whom there's little if no love lost. But unless they defeat Europe, defeating Europe might sort of buy them a bit more time, but if they don't defeat Europe, it's game over. I mean, they're screwed. They're really screwed. So I think people should be a bit more optimistic, because, all they have after that is turmoil within their own countries and against other countries. And really, I think if they start having a go at China, it really wouldn't surprise me if other nations such as China just say, right, that's it, everyone out of the sandpit, literally. Everyone out of the sandpit, we're taking your toys away. And it wouldn't surprise me if they just went in there and just tore stuff up, nuked Mecca or something, right? It really wouldn't surprise me if that happened, if the Mahometan world rubs those other countries the wrong way. But I don't think it's even going to get to that. I think Europe will beat them, and then these places will just collapse in upon themselves. So, chin up, guys. You guys do need to sort things out in Europe. You do need to overcome that existential crisis, and I think you will. But I think that's going to be their last hurrah. I really do. So chin up, if you guys can get through the next couple of decades, I think you guys are going to be okay. I think everyone's going to be okay. I think everyone's going to be over this. Finally, this scourge upon history, civilization, all that is good and beautiful in the world will finally fall in upon itself. Yay, All right, so that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for listening.